We're ready.
Okay, it's 9 a.m. and I want to welcome everyone to the Ed Prep and Licensure Subcommittee. We have on the phone with us our subcommittee members, as well as staff members from the Department of Education, as well as staff members from the State Board of Education. I do want to note that all materials from our last meeting, which was held on August the 27th, are archived on the State Board of Education's website for anyone who wishes to review them. I do also want to make note for all of our presenters, please state your name and title for the record. Thank you so much. We're going to move into the agenda rapidly. The first item on the agenda is a review of the proposed changes to the 2019 Ed Prep report card. Ms. Amy Owen and Ms. Erica Light, I turn it over to you.
Great, thank you. Good morning, Madam Chair and members. Our agenda for today is to review the proposed changes to the Ed Prep report card, provide an update on some changes to the middle grades math licensure assessments, and then hear some further work from the State Department of Education. It's a busy morning and we'll jump right in. I'm going to set the stage for information about changes to our Ed Prep report card, and then Erica Light, our Senior Research Associate, will go into depth about the nuts and bolts. As a quick reminder, we have two kinds of annual reporting on educator preparation in Tennessee. We have the State Board of Education report cards and the TDOE annual reports. These are both relying on a shared set of data that our teams are busily cleaning, coding, and checking for quality as we speak. As soon as this call is over, that's what they're going back to do. The State Board report cards are meant to be a high-level public report for external stakeholders, a way to have some public accountability on our about 40 Ed Prep programs, and highlight EPPs that have top performance on some of our state priority areas so we can all learn from them. The TDOE annual reports are much more detailed and they go to each individual provider. They set a minimum bar for programs to continue operation, and failing to meet expectation for 2 consecutive years on the annual reports triggers an interim review, and we do have a few programs who've begun to go through that interim review process this year. So specifically, I'm talking about the Ed Prep report card, that public accountability mechanism. The State Board is charged in law with producing this report card by February 15th every year. We've produced it in the same online format for the last 3 years. And while we've seen some real benefits of that format, we also think that it could be more accessible and useful for some new stakeholder groups. Traditionally, our Ed Prep providers, our legislators, state-level leaders, and community and advocacy groups have been using it as it's currently formatted. Our goal has been to make it a little bit more user-friendly for maybe somebody who wants to become a teacher or who has a child who wants to become a teacher and they're looking at where to go to school. For school-level leaders who are looking at where to direct folks maybe to get a master's degree, or for their new hires to try to do a job-embedded program. And for our district-level leaders that are in partnership with EPPs in their area to identify what are the strong suits of their local EPPs and where can they better work with them to make sure they're getting the results they need to support their schools. And really, since the beginning of 2019, the State Board has engaged in a comprehensive process of collecting feedback from these stakeholders. We had a Vanderbilt Fellow with us in the spring who spoke to students, about 40 students at 4 EPPs, to ask them, what do you wish you had known before you made your decision about where to get your teaching degree? We talked to school-level leaders, district leaders at both the superintendent's organization and with district HR professionals. And of course, we spoke to one of our most important constituents, the Ed Prep providers themselves, at the Colleges of Teacher Education Conference in September, also in September at a convening of the UT system schools, and we sent feedback forms to the private institutions through to KUA. So we've really been trying to reach out to everybody who is affected by this report card. And finally, we had an advisory council with Chairman John Reagan from the Tennessee General Assembly. Vice Chairman Bob Eby represented the State Board on it. We had folks from several different EPPs, public, private, and alternative providers. the superintendent's organization representing the district perspective, as well as Dr. Rosser from Knox County Schools, who works with human resources, and several partners from state-level advocacy organizations. So we've really been going to lots and lots of different folks. We appreciate the continued partnership as well of Michael and Jack at the Department of Ed, as well as with Dave at Tembo, the vendor that produces our website and is working on some new designs for us. Erica is going to go ahead and dive into the report card itself. It has several domains looking at candidate profile, employment, provider impact, satisfaction, and she's going to talk us through potential changes that our staff are recommending for the report card this year. And along the way, if you have thoughts or questions, please feel free to jump in.
All right. Good morning. This is Erica Light, Senior Research Associate with the State Board of Education. I'm going to go through each of the various domains that we look at on the report card and talk about the proposed changes that we have decided to make based on the feedback that we have received from all of the sources that Amy just spoke about. So the first domain of the report card is called Candidate Profile, and this is basically information about who are the people who are attending this educator preparation program. And one of the metrics we have in this domain is the percent of candidates with qualifying ACT, SAT, or Praxis core scores. This metric was previously scored in our report card at a value of 3 points. Based on feedback, we have decided that we are going to propose changing this to an unscored metric. We will still report it, but it would be worth 0 points. The rationale for this is twofold. First of all, the state board policy specifies the minimum scores needed for admission to an EPP, and compliance with this policy is monitored by the Department of Education. So essentially, if programs are complying with this policy, then having this on the report card is not really going to differentiate among programs because they would all be in compliance. And the other rationale is that we typically only have these scores for undergraduate candidates. Some graduate programs do require the GRE, but many of them do not, so we don't have an equivalent metric available for post-baccalaureate candidates. Next metric
Can we go back? Excuse me. Can we?
Oh.
This is Mike. Can we go back one?
Sure.
Explain to me again that about why we're like GRE in the good idea to have.
So not every post-baccalaureate program requires students to have a GRE, MAT, or other assessment to enter. In fact, many of them do not. There are other requirements in our EdPrep policy that they do have to look at. They have to look at their, what is it, Michael, their undergrad GPA, their GPA in their major. So they're looking at some measures of candidate preparation, but they're not necessarily looking at a GRE score. So if, go ahead.
Well, so some schools may have different standards on their GPAs. That doesn't really inform us as to the quality of their graduate program.
So we are not looking, it's not their GPA in the program, it's their undergrad GPA for being admitted to the graduate program.
You know, and that's what I was saying. Their undergraduate GPA may vary, and some may be potentially, don't know it, substandard.
So your concern is about the quality of undergraduate preparation, is that correct?
Yeah, getting into a graduate program from an undergraduate program that may be deficient.
I understand what you're saying there. I don't know that the report card is the mechanism to handle that.
Okay.
The DOE does monitor compliance with the policy itself, making sure they at least have that minimum GPA, And Mike, we'll talk in a little while about the assessments candidates take after they have had their preparation, so their Praxis 2 scores, their EdTPA, which would be looking at more of a measure of, have you been well prepared for these things in your program, whether it's undergrad or post-bac?
Okay.
So like regardless of what you're coming in with, have you been well prepared while you're there?
Got it.
Great, good question.
All right, thank you, Mike. So moving on to the percent of racially and ethnically diverse completers. This was previously scored at a value of 7 points, and our proposed new value is 10 points. The rationale for this is basically this is a very important metric to many of our stakeholders, and they thought, many of our advisory council members thought it would be a good idea to take those 3 points that we're no longer allocating to admissions assessments and reallocate them to this metric. According to a report that TDOE put out last year, students of color make up 37% of Tennessee's K-12 student population, but only about 13% of Tennessee teachers are people of color, so there's a clear imbalance there. There's also a growing body of research that indicates a variety of benefits from having racially and ethnically diverse teachers, including achievement, discipline, and social and emotional development benefits. Any questions before we move on from this one?
No, other than just
Okay.
it may be worth stating that this is something that the board feels very strongly about.
Thank you.
And this is Lillian. I agree with that. The one comment that I want to add to this is how can we make a determination if a ed prep program has an excellent plan for attracting students of color but still falls short? I don't know that there's going to be anyone else who's assigned to evaluating how successful their programs are, but some institutions who are in more rural areas where typically they've tried to attract based on the demographics and now are all over and doing their level best to attract students of color. But sometimes there's factors that come into play on the side of the students themselves that may say, I don't want to go to a predominantly white region of this state where I'm more of a minority than I am in my hometown. I'm just trying to be fair and thoughtful about this when an institution may be working incredibly hard, have hired somebody specifically to work on diversity and still fall short. So that would be my concern, is that how in the world would we know that they might have the best program in the state to attract but then fall short because of other factors beyond their control.
So would there be a way then to look at those schools that do have a draw from a population that does have a higher percentage of people of color and other demographics, and see how they're doing, just conversely that to like a rural school that has little or no diversity in the population they're drawing from?
Great. Those are both great questions. Lillian, I think to your point, when we get to the discussion of how EPPs will actually earn points on the report card, we had a bit of a debate in the office. We're setting a threshold for racially and ethnically diverse completers such that having any racially and ethnically diverse completers will earn you some points on the report card. There are targets where you would earn more points. For example, if you're a very small program, you have, 20, 30 people in your cohort, and you're adding even 2 or 3 people of color a year, you would see that. You would be earning more points on the report card even for just a small increase, because I do think you make a valid point that the regions of Tennessee are varied, and that this might be more straightforward for some programs than others. So we tried to intentionally set it such that even a small program, adding a couple people, they would see the benefit on the report card from that work. It's not that you have to get all the way up to 20% immediately in order to earn any points. I think Michael had some follow-up in terms of looking at programs plans for recruitment as well.
Yeah, I would just say, as we go through comprehensive reviews, recruitment plans are a pretty significant part of that review. And so we definitely heard from providers that I would say fall into the category of what you described, Lillian, that work with primarily rural districts that don't have significant diversity. But at the same time, I think many of those providers are doing a great job tapping into resources that are available to them to have targeted programs. And they've kind of expanded some of their reach into, I think about a lot of the reviews we've conducted this fall in East Tennessee. Many of those providers are working in Knoxville as well, and are able to tap into some of the diversity there. So I think that there's definitely still some challenges out there. We also hear about diversity as far as first-time college going, and we're trying to think through in the future, could that be something that we consider? But I think that there's a lot of work happening that we don't always hear about, but when we're on site reviewing, there are some really promising things happening in those small schools.
Well, I appreciate that, Michael. Thank you for saying that. And I still want us to be mindful, and I want us to look at it when we actually put this into place, see how that really reflects in the report. Because the other thing, too, is, I'm sure you all have talked about it, and I know the Ed Prep providers programs, they absolutely want to play the proper role in attracting students of color and from the diverse backgrounds. And so I just think we have to see how it plays out, because I also wonder, too, with the balance of their population, and if those numbers were to reflect generally what the population demographics look like, and then anything above and beyond that would be, I think, perhaps remarkable. But again, still, I think they're very focused on this, and I think they're going to do everything they can to make sure that those numbers increase. The other thing, too, is this is not for us to decide, but I think among the members of TACTI, I think they have an opportunity to look at best practices and learn from each other, because there is phenomenal work happening. And yes, urban areas have a better opportunity to attract students of color. So it would be still helpful to look at some of those factors, and that's, again, for TACTI to dive into and determine how they can help each other.
That is a huge point, and we have shifted at the department because we're often a very serious figure at those TACTI convenings. We're trying to get those convenings to be more EPT-driven and bring folks together to help learn from each other. The other quick point I'll make, another thing we're seeing is that there are efforts at the university, college and university level, to recruit diverse folks into the college, but those people don't always make it into the Ed Prep program. And so we're seeing that there has to be strong partnerships between the registrar's office and those broader recruitment efforts to, especially undeclared majors, to get those folks into teacher. So there are some successes and major resources being devoted to that at the university level. Don't always translate into gains at the Ed Prep.
Can I just
go ahead, Mike?
Just quickly, that would be very informative to us to sometime in a workshop sort of get a presentation on what those efforts are being done. So, it'd be informative to me to know kind of what universities and colleges are doing toward that effort that we're not aware of.
Well, I agree. I think we would like to know more. I'm sorry, somebody else is speaking?
Oh, I just said we're taking it down as a note. We'll work on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is Bob from an advisory council position on this. Let me tell you kind of where I came down on this is you look at the impact that the teachers of color and of ethnic backgrounds have on their students. And Mike talked about the rural counties. I think you'd be surprised at looking at from the rural counties what % of those are now Hispanic, et cetera. And so I think what this does is this puts a real emphasis on the EPPs to go out and actively really try to recruit to meet those requirements. And I think that's why we favored an increase in points on this, because it's so important.
And Mike, I'm sorry, Bob, I think we all agree with you on that point. I don't think there's any question. We have to push the envelope and increase the number of educators of color, and that includes Hispanics. So, but thank you. Glad you all pushed on that one.
All right. Our next metric is the percentage of high demand endorsements. We are recommending that we keep this at its current value of 10 points. The rationale for this is that it recognizes and rewards EPPs that are preparing teachers in areas of greatest need. This year, we will be keeping the same high demand endorsement list that we have used in previous years. So that includes secondary math, secondary science, Spanish, and special education. Am I missing it? Okay.
And ESL.
Oh, and ESL. But in the future, there is going to likely be a new policy, which will be, this policy is being presented to the board on final reading in February, that will require districts to report vacancy data to the Department of Education annually. And so starting for the report card that we would be preparing next year, we plan to look at that data and use that to potentially revise our high demand endorsement areas.
And that's part of policy 5.600, the strategic compensation policy that y'all saw on first reading in November.
Thank you.
Great.
Okay. The next domain of the report card is employment. First year employment in Tennessee public schools is a metric that we are required to report on in the statute that established the report card. So we are definitely still going to report this, but we are recommending that the point value for this be changed from 6 to 0 so that it would become a reported but unscored metric. The rationale for this is that the rate of employment in Tennessee public schools varies greatly depending on the location and mission of each EPP. We have many states bordering us here in Tennessee, and some of our EPPs are located very close to a state border, and therefore a good portion of their candidates may cross the border and take a job in a different state. There's also a number of religious EPPs that have as one of their missions preparing teachers for religious private schools. And we don't want to penalize EPPs for fulfilling their own mission. So that is our main rationale for having this be unscored. There is also currently no feasible way for us to track out-of-state or private school employment. And changing this to an unscored metric will bring it into closer alignment with the Department of Education's annual reports, which include first-year employment as an unscored metric. Any questions about this?
No questions, but I'm sure that the EPPs on the committee provided a lot of great input to come to this conclusion, because we heard this quite a bit over the course of the years that we were responsible for issuing the report card. So thank you for that.
We absolutely have it. I know that from the state board side, we talked about this a good bit of saying, well, as the board for public schools in Tennessee, we really are concerned with our public schools getting great employees from our Tennessee EPPs. And I think the switch we've made, which Erica will talk about in a moment, to focusing even more heavily on retention, does address what our public school districts need, which is for great teachers to start and stay there and continue to improve early in their careers.
Hey, let me ask a question. Do we have a sense on retention of the various reasons why they're not there after whatever time we 1 year, 3 years, whatever? I mean, some may not be retained by the school district. There's a lot of reasons why they move around, though.
You're absolutely right, Mike. I know we've talked about this. The reasons are quite varied. It might be that some folks go to graduate school. It might be that they have a spouse whose employment moves. They might simply decide to go to a different career, or they might be performing poorly and their district does not choose to retain them. We do not have access to district HR data about the reasons why folks exit.
How big a deal would it be to access that HR information in aggregate over the state?
A rather big deal.
We just don't have the data capabilities. I mean, I think, some of our completer surveys, those won't necessarily be people who are exiting in the moment, but we'll get a little more visibility into satisfaction of completers in their first few years. But unless districts are collecting that exit information and sharing it with us, it's still pretty anecdotal in terms of what we can generally compile around sort of why teachers leave the profession. I mean, I think it's something we have to keep working on, as a state and as a profession, but there's not a ready-made solution to kind of having that information in a standardized way when people do exit.
I'm not really talking about this being part of the report card, but it would, if the profession in Tennessee results in a number of people who are leaving, I'd like to know what we could do differently to keep them there, to make it something they'd want to stay in.
No, absolutely. It is the $1 million question. Jack, were you going to jump in on?
Yeah, hi, Mike. This is Jack Powers at the department. I mean, I think the takeaway is it would be pretty difficult to tell the why people are turning over, but we might be able to tell, we could look at who is turning over, perhaps, and characterize that group. And again, it wouldn't get at the reason, but we could, for example, see if teachers who show up as employed for a number of years and then do not show up as employed, we could look and see their effectiveness data.
And where they were employed,
where they were employed. And that wouldn't get us all the way to the answer why, but I think it would potentially be insightful.
And it's an interesting research question. I think we can certainly bring it up with our partners at HERA and other research organizations. It would probably involve some fairly qualitative work, but it's a fascinating question, and you're absolutely right. That is the $64,000 question of why would folks, are there structural reasons that folks leave that are within our purview, or is it personal reasons?
Great. So continuing on the topic of retention, we are keeping second-year retention as a scored metric in the report card with the same weighting of 9 points. Our stakeholders agreed that this value is appropriate considering the importance of this measure. And then we have decided to take the 6 points that were previously allocated to first-year employment and reassign those to third-year retention. This will hopefully incentivize EPPs to prepare teachers with staying power. And it's important to note that both of these metrics, second-year and third-year retention, you would only be included in this metric if you had been employed in a Tennessee public school to begin with, and then were also retained for a second year or a third year. So if you were not employed in a Tennessee public school your first year, you would not be included in these metrics.
And again, I think y'all know this, but just a reminder for anybody listening to the call, we are only looking here at retained in any Tennessee public school. So you can move from school to school within a district, you could move across a district. As long as you're in a Tennessee public school, you will count as retained.
Would you say that the vast majority of EPPs that serve on the advisory council were aligned with this opinion? I'm just curious.
I would. Bob, would you like to chime in about that discussion?
Yeah, I think people recognize, well, first, going back to the first year, because of the loss of students teachers across state lines and people going to graduate schools, they recognize the need for a change there, and then they felt like that the longer term was probably more important. And so, yeah, I would say in general, people agreed with that.
Great, thank you. Appreciate that.
Okay, and then the third domain on the report card is provider impact, which looks at the effectiveness in the classroom of the completers of each Ed Prep program. First, looking at classroom observation, Here we had previously allocated 6 points for the percentage of completers that have an observation score of 3 or higher out of a scale of 5. And we had allocated 9 points to the percentage of completers with a score of 4 or higher. Based on feedback that we've received from our stakeholders, we've decided to switch these weights around so that 9 points is allocated to score of 3+ and 6 points for a score of 4+. The rationale for this is that a teacher scoring at level 3 is considered to be meeting expectations, which is the minimum that we would want to see from new teachers entering the profession. Meanwhile, having a score of 4+ is a high bar for an early career teacher to meet, but we do want to encourage EPPs to aim for this bar as much as possible, which is why it is still scored. And then the next page, if you would hold your question maybe for one moment, because we have on the next page basically the same thing with TBOS. We have reversed the point values for score of 3+ and score of 4+, so that 3+ is weighted higher than 4+. And now if you have any questions about either of those, I'd be happy to take that.
I'll just say the EPPs and everybody were solidly behind this because, again, for that first-year teacher to score a 4+ was very, very difficult. And what you want them is you want good, solid teachers that meet expectations that can grow. So this was one that people felt very strongly about.
Thanks for that input, Bob. That sounds like it's sound and very logical in my mind.
As well, mate.
Okay. And then finally, we are planning to add 2 new unscored metrics to the report card this year. And it is possible that these may become scored in the future, but because we have not reported them before, they will be unscored this year. The first is satisfaction data from the Tennessee Educator Survey. This survey includes an early career module for teachers who are in their first 3 years of teaching. And it basically asks them questions about, like, how prepared did you feel by your educator preparation program, like on a scale of 1 to 4 or something like that. And we will take a look at the quality of this data and consider possibly scoring it in the future. The other new unscored metric is pass rates on EdTPA and Praxis subject assessments. We have previously reported pass rates on the Praxis Principles of Learning and Teaching assessment, but the new state board policy requires most completers, almost all completers, to take the EdTPA as their new pedagogical assessment. So at this point, most of the individuals who are in our report card cohorts still took the Praxis assessment rather than the EdTPA, which is one reason why we're not going to score this yet. But we do have some early implementers of the EdTPA. So we are going to look at what their pass rates have been. And then Praxis subject assessments are the specific subject area tests that you need to take in order to get an endorsement in a particular subject area. The Department of Education's annual reports already report pass rates on these assessments, and so we would like to include them in our report card as well. Any questions about those?
I will say I'd like to emphasize one point Erica made, that we're trying to really set the tone with the report card of before we start scoring data, we share it out for a year first so EPPs can start seeing what their data looks like and anticipating what their scores might be there, or if they need to make any program modifications. We are really careful. We don't want to surprise our ed prep partners. We want it to be clear if we're moving to score some kind of new metric, that we're very transparent about what that data is looking like.
And let me say this too, I think the advisory council is critical because of the people that participate in that, and that gives us real input from the stakeholders, particularly the ed prep providers, so we can listen to them at that point in time. So kudos to whoever set up the advisory council. That's critical to this process.
All right, moving on to performance categories. So this is the way that we assign an overall score to an EPP. In previous years, the last 3 years, we've had a 4-category system, which you can see in the table on the left. You had to get a certain percentage of points to determine which category you were in, with 1 being the lowest and 4 being the highest. We are proposing moving to a 3-category system in which the categories, instead of being numbered, are named exceeds expectations, meets expectations, and does not meet expectations. And as you will see from the percentages, essentially what used to be the 2 category and the 3 category have been combined into that middle category of meets expectations. One of the reasons we have decided to go to this system is we believe that the names of the categories are clearer, and especially for audiences who are unfamiliar with the report card. But we also had some statistical reasons for doing this. The goals of the performance categories are to make meaningful distinctions among EPPs and to highlight top performers. And regarding that first point with meaningful distinctions, especially with small EPPs, it's really difficult to make fine distinctions among programs that are performing in the middle of the pack. And so that's one reason for consolidating those 2 middle categories into a single category. The reason we're making this change now is we're making the change simultaneously with the various changes to the metric weights that we talked about previously, which we feel will help to prevent making false equivalencies with previous year's results. Any questions about the performance categories? We're going to get in a moment into the thresholds for each performance category. Okay. So for performance benchmarks, these are similar to previous years in that each metric has both a floor and a target. EPPs that are at or below the floor for a particular metric will receive 0 points, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they had 0 people who met that criterion. As we will see on the next slide, or a couple slides from now, the floor for most metrics is not set at 0. So you need to have significantly above 0 to receive any points at all, with the exception of racially and ethnically diverse completers, which, as we discussed before, we want to give EPP credit if they have any racially and ethnically diverse completers. EPPs who are at or above the target for a particular metric will receive full points for that metric, and then EPPs in between the floor and the target will receive a proportional amount of points. The threshold to meet expectations on a metric is to receive at least 40% of possible points, which again does not necessarily mean you have 40% of completers who meet that criterion. We'll get to the actual thresholds in a moment. And to exceed expectations, you need to receive at least 80% of possible points. How were these benchmarks set? In previous years, the floor and the target for each metric were based on percentiles. These were set in 2016 with the floor set at the 10th percentile of all EPPs in that year, and the target was set at the 90th percentile. These floors and targets have not been reset since 2016, so it was possible for all EPPs to show improvement. But for this year, since we had not made any changes to those in 3 years, we decided that it was time to adjust them. And so this time we've used a 3-year average, not including the current year, to set performance benchmarks. We rounded these averages to produce the final benchmarks, which are shown on the next slide. And here they are. So as you can see, there is, for most of the metrics, you have to get significantly above 0% to start receiving points. And then if you have anything anywhere above the floor, you will receive some points. Then there's, if you meet the threshold for meeting expectations, you would get a rating of meet expectations on that metric. There's a threshold for exceeding expectations, and if you reach the target, you will receive the maximum possible points for that metric.
That's a lot of information, a lot of percentiles. What questions do you have?
Those are not percentiles.
Percentages. Sorry, darn it. And then I make it more complicated.
This is Lillian. I just have a clarification. The difference between the percentage in each level. So let's just look at second-year retention. The floor is 80%, and then meets is 86 and 92 and 95 at the high end. Mm-hmm. What's the rationale regarding the percentage differences from one level to the next? Because it seems some of them are fairly consistent, like maybe a 6% difference between each level, and then some it might be 4 or 5, or I think 5. In some cases, it's 10 points between. So like student growth 3+, at the low end it's 45, then meets at 55, and then 5 additional on top of, 10 on top of that, and then 5 between exceeds expectations and the target maximum. Is there any rationale for those percentages differences? Does that make sense?
The floor and the target were set based on 3-year averages over the last 3 years. So what an average EPP at the lower end was doing and what an average EPP at the high end was doing. And then in between the floor and the target, if you are 40% of the way between the floor and the target, that's where the meets expectations benchmark is. And if you are 80% of the way between the floor and the target, that's where the exceeds expectations benchmark is. So for some of the metrics, the window between the floor and the target is wider just because there's more variation among EPPs on that metric, and therefore the gaps between meets expectations and exceeds expectations are also wider because it's all based on a proportion of points in between the floor and the target. Does that make sense?
It does, and I know that on the previous page you had talked about the 3-year averages being used to set the benchmarks. This clearly, shows that in reality, and that's why I wanted to make sure that I was understanding clearly what we were showing here. Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. So our next steps on the report card are to share this new scoring framework with stakeholders. We plan to send this out through the Department of Education Educator Update, and we are also planning to share it with EPP organizations such as TACT and TACUA. We are going to be creating a communications plan to publicize the report card release, and the report card launch is, as required by law, on February 15th, 2020.
Sarah, this is a place where, again, I know we've had conversations in the past, but I think we continue to want to think creatively about how we can get this report in the right people's hands in terms of usability for stakeholders, from EPPs to potential candidates, to high school guidance counselors, legislators. So any feedback you have here will be great. I know we've had some internal conversations about how to follow up with EPPs in particular in terms of their areas of strength and areas of potential growth, and we'll continue to talk about that. But any feedback or thoughts on the communication plan in particular?
So I've got a couple of comments here. Again, because the advisory council, a lot of these things were discussed, talked about, and I think you've taken the concepts and put them into this new framework, which is great. But I'm not sure the details of the framework have been presented to the EPPs, to the advisory council, and I think that's what you're going to do through this next step. What's the process if you get numerous comments back from that? Just thinking of this deadline, February 15th, how do you incorporate comments, or what, if they have comments, what happens to those comments?
That's a great question. It would really depend on what the specific challenge is. If there were, I'm trying to balance. I want to be clear that we think that this is a really strong way to move forward, and we don't, now that we've communicated it with you all and we're going to be sharing it publicly with EPPs, we don't want to change the goalpost at the last minute. Mm-hmm. But we do have some flexibility as we're working with our vendor. There are ways where once the data is already in, we can continue to adjust some of the things about scoring. If that were the area of concern, that's reasonably straightforward in the platform we have. But again, I don't want to give the impression that we're going to be changing this up until the last minute, because I think that creates some uncertainty.
All right.
We will continue, of course. You know, this is a big year of a redesign for us. The look and feel of the website will be different too. We're really excited to share it with folks. I think it's going to be it's just going to be clean. It's going to be easy to use. I'm excited about it. But in each interim year, we've had small changes. We've added disaggregations. We've added new ways to view data. We've made adjustments to specific metrics. So we think this is a really strong way to move forward, but we're not saying it's set in stone for the next 3 to 4 years. Does that make sense?
So basically what you're going to do is to kind of inform them on what the expectation is, on what you believe the board will take action on, so that they won't be surprised in February. And then as we go through in the next year, as we have in the past, if there needs to be small changes, et cetera, we're always can look at that.
Exactly.
Okay. Thank you.
Amy, this is Lillian. So for clarification, when we're talking about the communication plan, who is the targeted audience besides the ed prep providers, programs? Because I'm sitting here thinking we did a survey a while back and it didn't seem like the people in the field really used the report card, they didn't know where to find it. So I think about districts, school districts, and a communication plan to them, and you may have that embedded in these 3 or 4 bullet points. So I just want to get a clarification on who are you thinking about regarding the communication of its release?
Sure, and I think you're absolutely right. We had representatives from the superintendent's organization and from the HR professionals organization, district HR, on our advisory council, and both of them were really excited to go back and to share this with their groups. So TOS and TASPA are certainly audiences we're going to be working with closely. Erica and I presented at the HR conference in November alongside Dr. Roster from Knox County Schools. It was very well received. The districts were trying to take their EPP partners' data and identify areas of strength, areas where they could work together. They were really interested in using this to move forward. And I think, as Sarah mentioned, the last frontier for us, as you might say, is trying to reach those high school students who are thinking about teaching. It's a broad and difficult audience to reach. I think school counselors are a great way for us to work with that, as well as CTE programs on education as a pathway.
Great, thank you for that.
Excuse me. Go ahead. So this is Mike. Out of curiosity, if someone was to Google or whatever EPP quality in Tennessee, would this report card pop up?
That's a great question.
We could try Googling it.
We can let us do some digging. It sounds like a project for our intrepid communications staff.
Yes, we can also talk to our vendor, Tembo, about like some of the back end items on the report card that pop here when you make certain searches.
Right.
Bob, did you have something you wanted to say?
No.
Thought I heard you. Okay. I do want to say both to Amy and Erica and Sarah, honestly, when you started out, before we got on the call, Amy, you made the comment, you're excited to share the results of the work from the group as well as the advisory committee input. I want to say, first of all, I think, great work, excellent work, and then the way you articulated it to us to make it clearly understandable, that's huge. So thank you so much. I think you documented it well in the presentation materials, and then the articulation of that just beautifully executed. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you, Lillian. We appreciate the kudos, and I want to share them particularly with Erica, who joined our team in mid-August, so really just a few months ago, and has jumped in with both feet. And now, as you well noticed, she can speak on this with the fluency of the expert she's become, and I'm so happy to have her on our team.
Yes, she's an excellent addition. Thank you. Mike, were you saying something, or Bob?
All I want to do is echo exactly what you said. I fully agree. They're great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you kindly. If you all are ready, we're going to move to a short discussion of middle school math licensure assessments, and then hear from our colleagues at the Department of Ed on some work that's ongoing for them.
Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Great. So you might be saying, hey, wait a minute, didn't we just talk about middle grades and high school math licensure assessments a few years ago? And the answer is that we did. So the current status of our middle grades math assessments, and the reason we need to revisit it today, goes back to 2017 when the state board convened a group of educators, both K-12 and higher ed faculty, to review the available licensure assessments from several different vendors in the area of math. Part of the genesis of this was the shortage of math teachers. There were questions, and Mike, you are our number one person who is raising this question. Are our assessments meaningful? Are they rigorous enough? Are they aligned to Tennessee standards? So both ETS, the company that produces Praxis, and Pearson, which also produces licensure assessments used in other states, provided us with all of their available math assessments. And these educators reviewed them and made recommendations to the board. I'll talk about the high school recommendation later, but at the middle school recommendation was that the state board transition away from requiring the Praxis middle grades math assessment and move to the Pearson NES middle grades and early secondary math assessment. They found that it was more tightly aligned to Tennessee math standards, and they also recommended that that NES assessment allow educators to teach up through Algebra 1 or Integrated Math 1 in addition to middle grades math. As the name of the assessment suggests, it covers some of that early secondary material, and the educators felt like if somebody passed it, they should be able to teach up through that first high school math course. That change was presented to the board as part of the professional assessments policy and accepted beginning October of 2018. In the past few months, several EPPs have reached out to us and identified challenges that their candidates are experiencing with the Pearson NES exam. They've indicated quite a low pass rate for their candidates, and these are EPPs that are trusted partners. They're in the top performance categories on the report card. They have historically prepared their candidates well. And what they were noticing and what they were raising as a flag for us is that they focus their programming in this endorsement area on middle grades math, which is, of course, you know, the license that their candidates would get, that, what is it, Michael, 4.8 or 6.8 math. And they're not necessarily including programming that would prepare their folks to teach the early secondary level, which is a much bigger part of the Pearson NES assessment than it was for the Praxis one, which was focused only on middle grades. They were saying that, you know, if this trend continues, we might see a challenge of increased shortages of middle grades math teachers, which is, of course, the last thing that we want to have happen. And right now we're still in the process of updating our licensure rules to allow folks who would take that Pearson assessment to teach Algebra 1 or Integrated 1. So in other words, we're not even getting the benefit of increased licensure flexibility for those people yet. So here's what we are proposing, which would put us in alignment with what we're currently doing for high school math. Based on that 2017 review, the state board said that candidates who are looking to take the secondary math, the high school math assessment, could use either the Praxis or the Pearson NES assessment. The educator reviewers said both tests had high levels of rigor, although again, the Pearson one they felt was better aligned to Tennessee standards. And we went for it. That was the first time the board had allowed this dual option pathway for licensure. We felt like this is such a big shortage area. We might have folks coming in from another state where Pearson is more common. You know, let's give it a try and give folks this option between the Praxis or the Pearson test. Therefore, what we're proposing now for middle school is that same either or option, to add the Praxis middle grades math assessment back into the professional assessments policy as an option for candidates who are seeking that middle grades math license, and leave the Pearson NES middle grades and early secondary option in place. That might be appropriate for candidates who say, you know, I love math, I'm a math major, I feel really well prepared, and I want that flexibility to teach up through Algebra 1, I'm going to go for it. But for folks who say, you know, I've been trained on middle grades math, I know my middle grades math, I'm going to take an assessment focused on it, that's okay too. That would give us as a state more flexibility and also an individual candidate more flexibility to take the exam that feels most aligned to their preparation and to their desired employment. So what questions do y'all have about that?
So, Amy, just clarification then, based on what you said, is it likely that preps in Tennessee would go with the Praxis middle grade math assessment?
So it's actually down to a candidate decision.
It's a candidate, okay.
Correct. The ed preps, if they are preparing folks for middle grades math endorsements, they would continue preparing them the same way.
Right.
If an individual candidate feels prepared or would like, maybe if they want to teach in a school district where 8th grade Algebra 1 is very common and they want that on their, as an option on their license, they might pursue the Pearson assessment.
Okay.
How do we assure then that the teachers, if they get the endorsement for the middle grade, but they don't end up teaching outside their endorsement area then?
I mean, honestly, it's the same thing as any non-EOC course where you could teach up to 2 sections of one course outside of your endorsement area.
Okay, so they can.
Algebra 1 is an EOC course, so you would have to have the appropriate license for that course.
This is Michael Derline. There's also the Algebra 1 employment standard. So the middle grade.
I didn't hear. I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
Sorry. There's also the middle grade, or I'm sorry, the Algebra 1 employment standard. So educators who take the middle grades math assessment, even today, even after that assessment was phased out for the 6-8 math endorsement, educators can take that middle grades Pearson assessment and meet other qualifications to be able to teach Algebra 1.
But to Bob's question, are you saying if they do not take that Pearson assessment for that specific, like Algebra 1 endorsement, they cannot be put in that class?
To teach Algebra 1, you would have to either pass an approved assessment, which could be this Pearson middle grades up through early secondary. It could be a standalone Praxis Algebra 1 test. Or, Michael, there's still an Algebra 1 training, is that correct?
Yes,
offered by the employment standard offered by the Department of Ed. So you'd have to do one of those things.
So all those would be approved by the Department of Ed. In other words, a local district couldn't just give it to their teacher and say, oh, he passed.
Correct.
Nor would the district have the option of one of those up to 2 courses that they're not endorsed.
Correct, because Algebra 1, regardless of what grade it is taught, is an EOC course.
Amy,
Gotcha.
I apologize. I didn't hear the third one. You said first was Pearson NES, second was a standalone test.
Standalone Praxis test, and the third is an employment standard Algebra 1 training, which is part of our state board licensure rule. It's somewhere else because it's an employment standard. But that has been a long-standing option whereby there's a specific state Algebra 1 training that somebody with a middle grades math endorsement can go through in order to be allowed to teach Algebra 1.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So you all will see this in February on the professional assessments policy will be up on final reading. This would be a change between first and final. And we wanted to make sure our subcommittee was aware of the reasoning for that change. We'll, of course, go over it briefly when it's presented at the board meeting as well. And Michael has one more thing to add.
One thing I'd add on this is because assessments are valid for up to 5 years after they were taken, even during this period where the middle grades Pearson assessment was not permissible, if an educator took it, say, from out of state, it would be permissible once they apply for licensure.
Thank you.
Right. With that, I will turn it fully over to Michael for some updates from the Office of Educator Licensure and Preparation.
Hi, everyone. Michael Derline, Senior Director of Educator Licensure and Preparation. I have a few kind of quick hits that I'd like to go through on some updates to licensure, recommendations, our stakeholder engagement process, and then a couple updates to educator preparation as well. So we have some upcoming licensure recommendations based on some of the feedback we've received. One that we're working through internally right now would allow educators who hold an out-of-state professional level license, so somebody coming to us from another state that already holds a professional license in that state, to obtain the Tennessee professional license. That has been a piece of feedback we've received from many stakeholders, that educators who come to our state and have to be put on that practitioner license see that as kind of a negative thing, and so we're working through a possible recommendation to get them on the professional license when they apply. In addition, ETS is phasing out the current teaching reading assessment, which is a requirement for many of our endorsements. We're working internally to determine what our recommendation will be for that assessment. It'll be phased out in August of 2020. That assessment is being regenerated by ETS, which is a normal process to ensure that the assessment aligns with the current national standards. So it is possible that we will recommend adoption of that assessment, but we also want to make sure that whatever assessment educators are taking is well aligned to our approach to teaching reading in Tennessee.
When would that recommendation come, given the timing of the phase out?
So I think initial recommendation, I believe the professional assessment policy is coming on second reading in February. It'll need to come then. We want to make sure that there's time for phase in of that assessment for candidates who are getting licensed after August.
So we had a number of conversations with the educator groups and the state leaders who were helping review the existing options, and the regenerated test was sort of in development. So
yes,
we'll be interested to see what they're thinking and thoughts. I agree. That's going to be an important one, right?
And it's not an area we want to gap.
Right.
So.
Right.
Early childhood education, I know I've shared this before. We are continuing to convene stakeholders to really dig into our early childhood endorsement structures. What we would like to do is have a single endorsement that is essentially a dual endorsement that trains educators deeply in strategies for working with all students, including those receiving special education services. In February, we plan to bring a recommendation that will really just be about the endorsement structure and phase in and phase out. And then we will continue to convene this working group that we have on this topic to determine what the appropriate assessments and educator preparation standards would be. And once those are in place and policy, we'll then develop a proposal process for EPPs to apply to offer these programs. One challenge we're working through at the moment is if we do only offer an early childhood dual endorsement with special education, how are we going to address those individuals who come to us from other states that have only been trained in general education in the early grades? So we're trying to think through what we might do in that area.
I have a question. I had heard earlier this year from a couple of prep programs about challenges of implementing this in terms of the sheer volume of information that their candidates would need to know to earn a dual certification in this area. Is the working group looking at how that might be structured?
Yes. We actually already have an early childhood dual endorsement on the books, but right now we are really trying to dig into the appropriate grade spans. And even right now, our current thinking is even if providers offer that program, we would ask that they reapply because the standards for the Council on Exceptional Children are changing this next summer. The conversations we've had around implementation of these programs have really focused on a need for EPPs to better integrate special education strategies in existing coursework as opposed to tacking on additional courses. So I think that conversation will get even more detailed when we get into the proposal development process, because we are certainly not interested in programs being expanded to require 5-6 years of study to be able to get this endorsement. So we're going to work very carefully with that group to identify strategies that EPPs can employ to be able to better integrate special education into existing courses.
Excuse me, this is Mike again. Do you have any sense of the time frame that this would happen in?
Sure. So like we did with general middle grades, as well as the special education modified when it switched to the interventionist, this would have to take place over a number of years. So order of operations would be first, the board would vote on the endorsement structure, then the board would vote on EdPrep standards, as well as assessments. And then following that, we would create a proposal for any EPP that would like to apply to offer these programs. We would have to have a phase-out date of existing endorsements that is 4 or 5 years out. So that recommendation will come in February. That would allow prospective educators who are in the pipeline to be able to complete the program of study that was presented to them when they were enrolled in the program. In addition to early childhood endorsements, there is a broader effort to work on ensuring the licensure policy is aligned to the recently promulgated rule. So this policy will come in February, and will just be kind of a wholesale revision of the licensure policy now that much of that content is in the rule. A quick update on permits and waivers. I know we spoke about this briefly in August. We are obviously fully implementing a new process for reviewing and assessing permits and waivers. I think the biggest shift has been in permits. In the past, those applications were approved with no verification of content knowledge or enrollment in an educator preparation program. And that's kind of backwards because these are individuals who don't hold a license at all. And so now we have implemented a process by which educators seeking to teach on a permit the first year must demonstrate that they have content knowledge either through coursework or qualifying scores on required assessments. So we've been working very closely with districts that have a high incidence of permit applications, specifically Shelby County Schools. We have worked very closely with their HR department to make sure that this phase-in of new requirements goes smoothly. But I think ultimately we're seeing that districts are selecting folks who meet some content knowledge background to be able to serve in these positions. So I think that we're kind of optimistic about the approach and that now we will see educators, not that we didn't before, but we'll have evidence to see that educators are progressing in the process of obtaining a license.
Can you speak to waivers as well?
Waivers haven't changed significantly, but quite honestly, we don't issue as many waivers, but we have revised that process very slightly, and we're not seeing any challenges with that. Permits have been the much more significant shift. And yeah, as a reminder, waivers are issued to educators who already hold a license to be able to teach outside of their area of endorsement more than 2 courses. Also a reminder, neither permits nor waivers can be issued for special education courses or courses with an EOC.
So do we do any confirmation of content knowledge when we issue a waiver?
We do. Of course, I closed out of it. I had the document open for the requirements for first, second, and third year. If that would be helpful, we can share there's a district guidance document that we have that has all the information for requirements now for the first, second, and third year issuance. But yes, we do.
And we have in place something we're comfortable with in regard to verification of compliance of districts.
Compliance, just to make sure I'm clear.
Well,
I guess I think I was going to have a similar question: is how do we police? How do we assure that the districts are complying with these requirements?
Requirements related to permits and waivers, they are reviewed by about 3 people in our office. So the first thing that we do is review them to make sure that the course they're attempting to staff this educator in is not a course with an EOC or a special education course. Beyond that, this is an area where we're actually analyzing transcripts. So we don't do that for licensure issuance, but for verification of content knowledge for permits and waivers, we do. And again, they're reviewed by 2 or 3 people in our office. So this was an area that also, back when we had the sunset audit, there was a heavy analysis by the comptroller's office on how we were processing those and making sure we were doing it in alignment with state board rules, policies, any laws on the topic. So we're pretty hypersensitive to analyzing these applications appropriately.
So a waiver request comes in for a non-endorsed to teach chemistry, and it doesn't have an end of course exam.
Yep.
And the person's an English teacher, and that you all look at it, doesn't have an end of course exam. Are you likely to approve that?
So what we would look at, you gave me time to pull up the guidance so I could refresh my memory. Either they have to, if it's a first year waiver, so this is the first year that the educator is going to teach chemistry, they have to either have a degree in the content area or have completed a minimum of 6 credit hours in the content area or earned qualifying scores on the required assessment. That's first year. Second year, they must, if they hadn't in the first year, they must earn qualifying scores on the required assessment or be enrolled and on track in an approved educator preparation program leading to that endorsement. So it's kind of a progressive approach, and this is now the approach with permits as well, where they have to demonstrate content knowledge up front. If they haven't passed the
Hello?
Hello? I think we lost them.
Sounds like we lost them. I'll text Sarah in case they're not aware.
You still there, Mike?
Yeah, we just.
I'm here.
Okay, there you go.
We just got booted. I'll revisit everything I just said because I'm not sure when we got disconnected. So the criteria for a first year waiver. So if someone would like to teach chemistry, first we check that they have some content knowledge in chemistry specifically. So that's either a degree in the content area, 6 credit hours in the content area, or they've submitted qualifying scores on the required content assessment. Second year requirements, they must have either completed or passed the required content assessment or be enrolled and on track in an approved educator preparation program that would lead to that in chemistry endorsement. And then third year waiver requirements, they must be enrolled on track in a program leading to that endorsement. So it's a very kind of progressive approach where each year the educator must demonstrate that they are progressing toward adding the endorsement to their license in the case of a waiver or obtaining a license in that area in the case of a permit.
So here's my heartburn with that. I can see where the progressive approach from 6 credit hours to being enrolled in a program is logical. I don't see how that's in the best interest of the kids who are taking that person's course, chemistry, say, and they've had, are we out again?
No, we're here.
Okay.
I'm still here.
I'm still
So that 1 year, let's say the first year, and the person has 6 credit hours in chemistry. Are we saying that person is in the best interest of the kids who are in that classroom?
I think what we're saying is that person meets the minimum qualifications to teach chemistry for that year and must continue to progress to be able to add that endorsement. In most cases, this is the difference between an ongoing substitute teacher in the classroom versus someone who has a background in the content area.
See, I just think that really doesn't set those kids up who happen to be in that class that year to get the content knowledge from the teacher that they need to achieve some level of adequate mastery of the course.
Mike, one question I have that I'm wondering if the department can start tracking and share back with the board is for that first year waiver. How are most people earning it? Are they earning it by having the degree, by having the 6 hours, or by passing the license subject specific assessment? I think if we had that information, we might say, oh, most people are doing this by passing the chemistry praxis, or because they were a major in field X, but they got their license in field Y. I think we just need a little bit more information about which is most prevalent.
I'd add to that we could also look at the performance of these educators. So are we seeing that educators who are teaching courses on a permit or a waiver, and this gets tricky, lots of challenges with business rules there, are they performing at a valued level, both on team rubric and if there's any growth areas, though that's limited because it can't be an EOC.
So, I'm keeping beating a dead horse, but doing that analysis if it takes years, then that's putting years of kids at risk.
So, Mike, this is Lillian. I'm going to jump in because I know we have had this discussion for a very, very long time. And so with having permits and waivers, in particular we're talking about permits now, this is while someone is on track, hopefully, to receive the proper endorsement. I get stuck on, so what is the alternative? Because we're not seeing an increased numbers enrolling in ed prep programs, and we know that's the solution is having more people enrolled and graduating with the proper endorsement. But what do we do in the meantime? So is this still not our best option? Because, again, and I like what Mike said about Durline, about looking at the educator and the successes of the educator. And if we had some way to look at the successes of the students, that would be hugely impactful. But I'm thinking this is what we must do, perhaps, because it seems like it's right, as long as we have a shortage of teachers with the proper endorsement. Because these students are going to be graduating, and is it worse for them to have no one than to have someone who has working toward that endorsement? That's my question of the day.
But they don't have an end-of-course exam, right?
Correct.
So if they don't have an end-of-course exam, we don't know whether that educator has done their job of instructing and whether that person has gotten the information. So we send them off to colleges or universities or whatever and don't have a clue whether they can do it or not.
So what is the solution? How do we get there?
I think the challenge that has to be met is we have to figure out what the core reason is for these shortages and fix it. But putting a warm body in a classroom and believing that is better than having someone with the content knowledge is not an acceptable. I know it makes sense from managing a school standpoint. Somebody calls in and says, I'm not going to be back 2 weeks before class, and you got to have somebody in that classroom. But for the kid standpoint, we're saying we're offering chemistry, and you're going to have the opportunity to master it, and yet we're putting someone in there that we don't know has the content knowledge. If we're looking at it from our responsibility to the student, then the state, the LEAs, us, everybody's got to look at what can happen to get these in there and these qualified people in there. And I don't believe having an English teacher in a chemistry class is any better than having no one.
Mike, Sarah, I would agree. But I think, just to go back to Amy's suggestion, because I know we're getting a little short on time, I think what will be productive is to actually look at the data on who is getting these waivers. And Michael, you were nodding. Is that something, I mean, in terms of both the effectiveness of the people, but also how they're getting, like,
how they're getting it's a little trickier because that's not something we capture in T-Encompass, but it's definitely something we can think creatively about how we could get some data on. I will also add with waivers, these are folks who have already completed a preparation program.
They're licensed.
They've been trained in pedagogy. So, and now we're saying they must have some background in the content knowledge. 2 of the 3 options are no different than job embedded. With a job embedded program, you can enter that program with a major in the content area or passing scores on the required assessment. So I think permits are probably the place to really dig in, honestly, because that's where people don't, that's truly an emergency credential. And we issue way more of those anyway. So I think that's definitely an area we should explore in the future.
The other thing I was saying too that I think is important, I mean, I'm not sure if this is widespread, but the requirement is that if a teacher is teaching out of endorsement, basically the parent needs to be notified that that's happening. Because I think that puts pressure on our school districts too to not make that a long-term solution when parents are notified. But, you know, anyway, I mean, this is not something that's easy to solve clearly, but Mike, your points are right on. I think let's commit to looking at additional data and taking additional action. I think the testing and accountability subcommittee will probably also have this conversation in a related way about sort of the accountability provisions around, you know, how we deal with shortage areas.
I just, one thing, if we're going to go this route, it cannot take years to develop the data. You know, you got to think about a classroom or more of children who are at risk while we contemplate what the deal is. Truth is, we should have crossed this bridge decades ago, but I think we ought to look at this with some level of urgency rather than looking at it as to, well, is this only going to affect 5% of the kids? That 5% have a right to get the same instruction that the other 95% have.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think the urgency is well warranted. You know, it's crux. It's a supply-demand issue that we have to keep, you know, actively trying to solve. You know, I mean, we could commit to coming back to our next subcommittee meeting with some additional data, I think.
Yeah,
Michael's saying yes, so let's plan for that.
Okay.
Lastly, on licensure, just want to highlight some areas of continued stakeholder engagement. We're hearing from our HR directors of schools. Our Assistant Commissioner, David Donaldson, reviewed all of the surveys following the roadshow that we conducted back it was just last month, I feel like it was 3 months ago. Many recommendations are coming through. We're kind of assessing the appropriateness of those and possible implications. David is also working on development of a TASPA kitchen cabinet, which I think is in the early stages, but would be similar to the Educator Preparation Working Group, and that would be a group of HR professionals and districts that can continue to provide recommendations on licensure and raise any challenges they have with regard to staffing. On educator preparation, we have finished a full semester of both state-managed and joint Cape and state comprehensive reviews. We have traversed the entire state. I have grown to have a strong appreciation, even more so than I did, for various parts of the state. And we are pretty excited about what's coming out of those reviews. So we are using, for the first time, the Tennessee Comprehensive Review rubric. So all of the evidence that is submitted by EPPs results in recommendations from the review team members, all of which have been trained. So we have about 60 trained review team members. We actually had to go back and train 10 more just a few weeks ago because we were short on reviewers. And we really believe that those reviews are resulting in high quality feedback to the EPP and clarity around how the recommendations were derived. So next steps on fall reviews, final reports are being generated following the on-site visits that will go to the 7 EPPs. Rejoinders then follow, so the EPP has an opportunity to respond to the findings. They do not have an opportunity to submit additional evidence. It's simply a response to the report. And then we will convene an advisory committee that will review both the final report and the rejoinder and ensure that the findings and recommendations are aligned. So we want to make sure that there aren't review teams that are more or less rigorous than others. And then they'll have the ability to look across reviews and ensure consistency of implementation. We anticipate that, at least for the state-managed reviews, we will be able to bring recommendations to the board this summer. So the July meeting would be our target meeting to recommend status updates for EPPs going through state-managed reviews. And that should also be the case for the CAPE reviews, though it's dependent on when the advisory committee meets. So just wanted to share kind of the good news on that. It was, 2 years of work that we engaged in to develop the handbook, and it's working well. And then lastly, Amy already shared, I think, the positive working relationship we've had with the State Board staff on development of the report card and annual reports. Just wanted to reiterate that. We're on track to produce annual reports. We're actually ahead of schedule, and we're very excited about the work that's been done on both sides. The addition of Jack Powers on our team has been critical. And so I just wanted to kind of just share some positive news around annual reports. We do not anticipate any major changes to annual reports this year, though we are planning to implement a standardized employer survey in the early spring, which would be included on the annual reports insights tool. With next year, we would anticipate that we would be able to put that on the performance report in an accountability framework. But we would want to go back to the educator preparation working group to be able to determine appropriate thresholds for that survey. Happy to take any questions on any of this.
I've asked mine.
You've asked yours, okay. Bob, anything from you?
Nope, I'm satisfied, thank you.
Michael, this is Lillian. I certainly want to tell you thank you so much, because I don't think anybody understands fully what you all have to do behind the scenes to come before us and present. So I absolutely want to thank you for that and for your continued work in this arena. I don't recall if we've met Jack before, and Jack, if I've met you, I apologize. But I think it would be helpful for us to know a little bit about you, if you don't mind sharing a little bit about your background and when you.
Sure, I'm used to doing this at the beginning, but I'll go ahead and do it now. So I have been with Michael's team for about 7 months now. I'm the director of data and research, and my main responsibility and role is the production of the annual reports. So Erica and I are in lockstep, I think pretty much year-round now. And in addition to that, I dabble in licensure a little bit, kind of fill in wherever there's a need. Before this, I was actually at the Tennessee Comptroller's Office of Education Accountability. And there I did education research for the General Assembly. And I actually authored a report on teacher preparation while I was at the Comptroller's Office. I'm originally from Memphis, Tennessee. I attended Tennessee public schools, and I was a public school teacher both in Mississippi and here in Tennessee.
Excellent. Well, have I met you, honestly?
We may have met in passing. Okay. To be honest, I definitely know who you are. I'm not sure if we've met face to face.
We'll make sure. Workshop.
We definitely can.
Yeah. I was going to say, certainly have met a lot of people in my time serving on the state board. So I'm glad you joined the team, and I'm pleased to hear that you're working closely with Erica.
Yes.
Any other closing comments or remarks from anyone? Because I think this has been incredible information that you've shared today. And getting back to Mike's point, and always, we appreciate all the collection of data that helps us make the best and wisest decisions in licensure. So, Mike, I understand Michael, understand sometimes it's hard to get at that, but whatever you can do to continue to think about that, what type of data will help us make better and more informed decisions, that would be greatly appreciated. Sarah, anything from you or anybody else on the team?
Not really. I echo everything folks have said here. We've loved having Jack on the team, and he and Erica, like they said, are working really closely, which makes all of this just so much smoother on everybody's front. So we appreciate their partnership. Michael and Jack and the others at TDOE. Great call today. I appreciate the engagement from our board members too. And we've got a few to-dos following today in terms of planning for the next meeting. And certainly as we think about the rollout of the report card, we'll be in touch and think through some of those next steps with all of you.
Great. Thank you all so very much, and I hope you enjoy your holidays.
Merry Christmas.
I'm sure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye.